all, I will just introduce myself. My name is Allison Wiedrick, and I am the current president of Preservation Rocky Mount. I also work for the City of Rocky Mount as the art curator of the Marie V. Howard Art Center. I know the history and the art thing doesn't always go together, but I like both. So here we are. I'm very happy that you're all here today. JoSeth is with the city, and he's agreed to do this presentation with us today. And so I'm excited to have him here, because this month is May, and as you may or may not know, May is Historic Preservation Month. And so, here in the back. And so next Tuesday, this is the first of two programs we're doing. Next Tuesday, we're going to be working with Charles Dunn with the Way Back When Rocky Mount page on Facebook. If any of you don't know of it, I suggest that you follow it. It's a really interesting page where he refers to a lot of historic structures and historic businesses and all kinds of things of Rocky Mount. So what he's going to do next Tuesday, same time, same place, is to go through some of his favorite, mostly architectural pieces from Rocky Mount. So he's going to focus on civic, residential, and commercial structures. So because that is a different program, this one is going to be refreshments. And for members, it'll be free to all who attend. If you're a non-member, it's just $5 to participate. So if you'd like to come and not pay, you can pay your membership fee now before you leave, or have a membership station set up in the back. You can sign up online. We have the Wi-Fi hooked up. Or you can take a membership form to go and mail it in. First of all, I want to thank the board for putting this all together. If you are a board member for Preservation Rocky Mount, will you raise your hand? Okay, look around the room, everyone, because these are the people who you can talk to get more information about our organization and how you can get involved as a volunteer or as a board member. I also want to have a special shout out for Valerie Steele. She is our programs chair, and she helped organize this. She was the one who coordinated with JoSeth, and she's the one who coordinated with Charles Dunn. So big thank you to her. I also want to thank Barbara, because she's our marketing chair, and she helped get this out to everyone, and that's why all of you are here, I assume. And then finally, of course, I want to thank JoSeth for agreeing to work with us. So at Preservation Rocky Mount, our mission is to retain the architectural heritage, neighborhood character, and historic landscapes of Rocky Mount, North Carolina through collaboration, education, advocacy, and restoration. And this year, we are beefing up our programs. As you can see, we're doing 2 this month, and there will be more to come. We're also focusing on the future of our salvage store, and if you're interested in our salvage store, I encourage you to talk to Adrian, who is our salvage store chair. And we're also trying to establish partnerships with mind-like organizations and departments, which, of course, brings me to JoSeth. So he's going to get started in just a minute, but I want to give you a brief intro of who he is. JoSeth is the Interim Director of Development Services for the City of Rocky Mount, where he has been employed since 2008. While his job entails nearly all aspects of land use planning, and more recently attention to building trades review and permitting procedures, he points to his work with citizens to maneuver through the Historic Preservation Certificate of Appropriateness process and compiling information to the Lincoln Park, the first African subdivision in the city, listed on the National Register of Historic Places as his most rewarding accomplishments. He has been a member of the American Institute of Certified Planners since 2013. As a native of North Carolina, he received his Bachelor's of Science degree in Urban and Regional Planning from East Carolina University in 2007. And JoSeth enjoys time with his family and spends much of it with his 7-year-old son, Rain. So without further ado, take it away, JoSeth, and thank you all for being here.
It's a pleasure to be with you all this evening. As Allison mentioned, I am employed with the City of Rocky Mount. I started back in 2008 in June, so coming up right at 10 years, which is kind of mind-blowing for myself. And if you're like the other people who come along, it's probably mind-blowing for you, because you wouldn't have guessed I'd been at the city that long ago based on my appearance. I'm still, I bathe in that every time it's mentioned. Yeah, so she mentioned I'm a native of North Carolina. Grew up in Tarboro. Lived there since I was 7. My mom's family has always resided in the area. Coming to Rocky Mount, as a kid, you went to the mall out on 301. And when you were a kid in my day and age. For others, you know, if you came to Rocky Mount to shop, you probably did that right here in downtown Rocky Mount. To work in Rocky Mount is really a passion for me. She mentioned I went to East Carolina and studied urban and regional planning, and I did that with the notion that I would, you know, work in this Eastern North Carolina region to help be a part of, you know, making it something. You know, I recognize that every place, you know, started from, you know, not much. And while Rocky Mount is a little bit more than not much, it specifically is the economic hub for this region. So I've been thrilled to have been a part of the growth we've seen since 2008, and I'm excited about what's to come in the near and long range. So in regards to historic preservation, I really did not have a passion for it initially, and I won't claim to really have a deep passion for it now, but I appreciate it a little bit more than I did when I was handed the task during the depths of the recession back in 2009. The city had two part-time preservation planners who resigned, retired, and due to there not being much on the development side of things, they said, oh, you can take it on and get your other stuff done as well. But it's been a real pleasure to work with the citizens, as Allison mentioned in the intro. And again, one of the biggest things was working with citizens to have the Lincoln Park National Register Historic District established. In my work with the city and historic preservation, one of the main things is to serve as a liaison to the Historic Preservation Commission. The HPC, we call it for short, is a citizen-appointed board of 9 Rocky Mount residents. They serve staggered terms, 4-year terms. If you're interested in serving on the Preservation Commission, I would urge you to fill out an interest form and file that with the city clerk's office. We do presently have a vacancy, and the term will be starting in July. The Commission is the lead authority in regards to compiling an inventory of the significant properties around the city, also designating landmarks and historic districts, promoting preservation efforts, and reviewing certificate of appropriateness proposals for alterations, demolitions, or new construction within the historic districts or designated landmarks. As the talk goes on, we'll definitely dive into the different historic districts and landmarks that we have here in the city. The Preservation Commission meets monthly on the 4th Tuesday of each month. That meeting is held in City Hall on the 3rd floor in the committee room. Generally, there are some meeting of the minds to review proposals for certificates of appropriateness. And that is a proposal by a property owner to do exterior alterations to their property, those properties being the ones in one of our designated local historic overlay districts. And we'll talk more about that later, what exactly that means. The Preservation Commission was established in 1997 by ordinance of the city. As I mentioned, we presently have 8 members. It's a 9-member voting board. We do sometimes have appointed ex officio members who can give technical feedback if they have some expertise with architecture or specific history on certain properties or certain historic districts. But this is a list of people who have served on the commission over the years, and just thought it'd be interesting to include that. You probably recognize some of the names from people who do other walks of life here in the city. Again, the city has historic districts, and we have historic landmarks. You may have picked up already in my early discussion that there are two types of historic districts that are recognized. You have National Register of Historic Places districts, and you have local historic overlay districts. The National Register of Historic Places is our country's official list of buildings, structures, objects, sites, and districts worthy of preservation for their significance in American history, architecture, archaeology, and/or culture. The National Register was created by an act in 1966, so 52 years into the preservation movement here in this country. And again, that was done to recognize and protect properties of historic and cultural significance. National Register listing can be of districts or landmarks or archaeological sites. We haven't designated any archaeological sites here in Rocky Mount, but the East Coast is probably, if somebody got to digging, we could find one to designate. Again, National Register listing is primarily an honor. The listing of a historic or archaeological property in the National Register, it doesn't obligate or restrict the private owner in any way. The only time that you would be asked to specific things of you is if you were seeking some federal assistance or benefit, such as a grant or tax credits, and we'll talk about those incentives later. For a private owner, the chief practical benefit of National Register listing is eligibility, again, for federal and state investment tax credits that can be claimed against the cost of certified rehab of a historic building. Within Rocky Mount, we have 7 districts listed on the National Register. That's a pretty fair amount, more than many other communities in this region. So local overlay historic districts. Local historic district designation is a type of zoning that's generally applied to protect entire areas or groups of historic structures. Historic district zoning can help improve property values by stabilizing and enhancing the neighborhood's character, and benefits property owners by protecting them from insensitive changes that other property owners within the district may want to make to their property that would potentially destroy the historic qualities of the neighborhood. Property owners within local historic districts are required to obtain what we call a COA, or Certificate of Appropriateness. Those, again, are reviewed by the HPC before making significant exterior changes or additions to a property. Before beginning new construction and before demolishing or relocating a building or structure. So since 2000, the City Council has approved local designation for 4 of our 7 historic districts locally. Those include the Rocky Mount Mills Village, Edgemont, Central City, and Villa Place historic districts. Local designation generally comes about when the neighborhood groups within those districts come to the city and petition to have the district recognized or designated. That process, definitely, we look for community buy-in. The most recent local district designated was Villa Place, which was done back in 2010. And that was my first real foray into working with the historic district designation process. I've passed around a booklet that I see some of you have started to thumb through. That includes...
Does anybody need one?
I'm sorry. That includes a brief description of each of the 7 historic districts, as well as information on local landmarks that have been designated here in Rocky Mount. And keep that handy. I'll encourage you all to use that to follow the next few slides. Looking at the historic districts, the first that I believe was designated on the National Register here in Rocky Mount was the Central City Historic District. Rocky Mount is in its 151st year of its charter, or at least of its existence. I'm not sure if the charter dates back that far, but the city, initially started out at the falls of the Tar, at the Rocky Mound, with the post office. But with the coming of the rail line that runs right here on Main Street in the early 1900s, the development and action here kind of shifted to the downtown. It's a cohesive collection of commercial and industrial and some limited residential above those commercial storefronts that, again, came to be rapidly developed at the turn of the late 19th and early 20th century. Again, it's driven by the railroad coming through, the Atlantic Coast Line Railroad, and tobacco processing and sales. Rocky Mount, the northern end of Central City, was once recognized as Tobacco Town. You may have heard that in the past with the China America Tobacco Processing Building, the Imperial Center, or Imperial Tobacco Processing Facility, along with a large number of warehouses. Obviously, the spine of the district is Main Street. And the district extends to the east and west over to Church Street and Washington Street. The southern boundary is not far past the train station, the bus depot. At the northern end, the Imperial Center is probably the northernmost landmark within the Central City District. Another district that we have in Rocky Mount is Edgemont. Image there is a streetscape view looking west on Hill Street. One of my favorite pictures within that area. Edgemont, it's 3 blocks east of Main Street here in Rocky Mount, and was platted back in 1914 by Luther D. Harper. If you can imagine it, at the time, that was farmland. Edgemont would have been considered a suburb of Rocky Mount. The principal avenue is Tarboro Street, and that's flanked by Sycamore and Hill Street. And those are the core streets of the subdivision. 4 crossing streets that cross those perpendicular. And then one of the unique things that I really like about Edgemont is the service alleys that run at the rear of the properties. If you can imagine, back in 1914, the automobile wasn't as prominent as it is now, so that wasn't, having a driveway wasn't an important feature of the property. It probably added to its aesthetic appeal, not to have cars and driveways all in the front of the yard during those times. So really that district came to be with the growth of the railroad and business associated with the railroad. We have repair shops in Rocky Mount that serviced, train cars that came through. Again, tobacco market of the early 20th century. Edgemont was recognized as being very stylish. Doctors, lawyers, tobacconists, salesmen, clerks, and employees of the railroad built bungalows, four squares, colonial and Tudor revival style houses on the spacious lots. Edgemont is pretty flat. Along those alleys were garages. I guess some people had cars, but they may have been placing buggies in there back in those days. I wasn't there. Yeah, so the Edgemont district is significant in the area of community development. Again, one of the major subdivisions of pre-World War II boom period here in Rocky Mount. And it remains very intact today. A lot of investment opportunity in the Edgemont Historic District. A lot of well taken care of homes in the Edgemont Historic District. Another one is Falls Road. Falls Road is, as you may have guessed, on Falls Road. It's one of our smaller historic districts, but very stately as well. Well preserved. It's a residential district and contains approximately 100 historic buildings, most of those being houses. It grew around the early 20th century and through 1950, northwest of downtown. Again, those people who were building homes and residing there, tobacconists, businessmen, physicians. The homes are very stylish. Let's see if we can. Local architects built in Falls Road. DJ Rose, that's a name that you still see doing contracting work here in Rocky Mount. Sam Toller, architects John Stout and Thomas Herman. If you get a chance, look up Thomas Herman. I hope you'll get some good results, but throughout all of these historic nominations, the listings on the National Register site, that name is prominent through all of them. So he was a big deal here in Rocky Mount as far as designing and having these homes constructed. Style of home you'll find in Falls Road District: Queen Anne, Colonial Revival, Neoclassical Revival, Georgian Revival, and Craftsman styles. I regret I don't have more pictures to kind of give you a visual of these homes, but I imagine the gentleman that will be here a week from now will have more of those. So I urge you to be here for that. Lincoln Park. We mentioned at the onset that Lincoln Park was a district that I personally had a hand in being recognized. I also mentioned that we had two preservation planners who retired, and that's how I came into the role as liaison to our commission. Prior to one of the guys retiring, his name was Rudolph Knight, very passionate historian from the Twin Counties, grew up in Edgecombe County. He took me on a ride. He said, I'm going to take you to Lincoln Park. This is the next place we have to get designated. And then he retired. So I was like, well, I guess it's on me. But I took it as a challenge. We had members of our city council who put together a small group of citizens, and I can remember like yesterday going into one of the ladies' homes and sitting around the table, the Southern hospitality that she offered, and just beginning to take in the stories about why the neighborhood was so important to her and her neighbors. So this was my first foray into preparing a historic nomination. It's akin to preparing a research project. You have to do interviews with people, get a lot of oral history, go around. You got to be a good photographer. Document the architecture, the buildings, the streetscapes within the area. But definitely the main thing to me was sitting down one-on-one with those people and just getting those stories of how it was back in the day in that area. Lincoln Park was developed in the 40s, early 50s after World War II. It was targeted to African Americans, educators, military people coming home from the war. A lot of the homes were constructed with assistance of the GI bills, I think. Yeah. And it was developed, subdivided by Wimberley and Gregory, which is also a firm that's still doing business here in Rocky Mount. These homes are minimal traditional style. They're not much more than a rectangle and an A-frame roof. So it wasn't so much the architecture that was recognized as significant as it was the cultural impact of that district. Back in that day, there was still lots of segregation. So part of the subdivision was a restaurant and motel. The motel would serve blacks who were traveling through the area, blacks who were traveling with white families that weren't allowed to stay in the same lodging facilities as those families. So very important piece of Rocky Mount's timeline. What else can I say about Lincoln Park? The restaurant was very popular, apparently. We worked with the daughter of the proprietors of the restaurant, and she had a business card that listed the distances along the East Coast of major, metropolises, Miami, New York City, in miles. And apparently people would come from a long way away for the barbecue that they served at the Lincoln Park Motel and Restaurant. She gave me a little history on the process they would use to, produce the barbecue, to cook it up, and it's fascinating, but really good stuff. I'm not sure if anybody's doing it like they did it back in that time now, but that was one of the things that nearly everyone mentioned who had some knowledge of the place back when we were preparing the nomination. The Rocky Mount Mills Village, another very important place in our history. Obviously the Mills Village was developed to serve the Rocky Mount Mills. I've got to add that S, which was the second textile mill to come into existence here in North Carolina. It first built in 1818. As you're all aware, I'm certain, recently this area has really experienced a revitalization, a rebirth. A lot of these houses, could have been torn down years ago when you looked at the condition they were in, but there was foresight that, hey, let's not do that. The area was designated as a historic district back in the 90s, I believe. It changed hands a couple times before you started to see any reinvestment, but look at it now. There's been bukus of money poured into the village and the mills itself, and it's now, generating a lot of excitement for the city and become one of the, premier destinations within Rocky Mountain. Villa Place. This is one of my favorite things that's now located in Villa Place. Let me see if I can get that caption. The W.D. Cocking House, circa 1900. Believe it or not, this house wasn't always in Villa Place. This house was moved from Main Street. So yeah, at some point, there were houses like this right on Main Street. It's got a great owner who is taking intricate care and applied this amazing paint job. Definitely one of the standout properties within that neighborhood. There's a lot of jewels, if you will, in the Villa Place neighborhood. You've got the Mac Haven House, the Pope Funeral Home. I'm not sure its historic name, but that's just another marvelous.
The Keel.
The Keel House. Thank you, Ms. Bailey. Another marvelous structure. You've got Rainbow Road there on Nash Street, Pearl Street. Really special place here in the city. Villa Place is roughly 9 blocks. Most of the houses built between 1900 and 1940s. Again, its proximity to downtown, you had a lot of employees of the railroad and other businesses. It says West End Land Development Company laid out the district in 1891 and sold lots until 1907. You got West School in the district, which was the first public graded school in Rocky Mount, and that was built in 1901. Its successor, James Craig Braswell School, was a modern style building erected in 1940 and still in use. Matt Haven, I mentioned, is what they call neoclassical revival style mansion. And that was designed by an architect out of Raleigh named Keller. So Villa Place is another area that is, we're starting to see investment in, properties changing hands, out-of-town people mostly, coming in, recognizing the significance of the neighborhood. West Haven. West Haven is really cool. West Haven is about 25 blocks. It's about a mile west of downtown and adjacent to the river. This was a high point of residential development in Nash County following the First World War. It's one of the first planned developments in Rocky Mount that was not laid out on the grid system. Within the other neighborhoods that we've talked about so far, save for Lincoln Park, it's similar to West Haven, but came later, how it's laid out. The other neighborhoods are, have perpendicular streets that run through them. But West Haven has curvilinear streets. With curvilinear streets, you get these terminating viewpoints where, if you're standing here, the street curves and you don't just see, I can't think of the term, a vanishing point, but you see nice, stately building there. You get that a little bit here in the downtown as well. Think about, look around, or pay attention when you're riding around, especially on Franklin Street. If you look back in your rearview mirror, you can see the library. That's really cool to me. And there's a couple other places here in the downtown area that the streets angle and you get that building right there at the terminating view. So West Haven has that feature throughout. Spacious lawns, colonial style revival, housing, and you know that it was laid out that way to kind of give you a sense that you're not in the bustling activity that would have been taking place in the downtown during that day. You know, trains coming by, people auctioning tobacco on the streets, that kind of thing. Give you a little more peaceful type feeling. John Wells developed the subdivision in 1928 and has two small parks within the neighborhood. That's another cool feature. Thomas Herman, again, was out of Wilson, and then Harry Harles of Rocky Mount, along with D.J. Rhodes and Samuel Toller built those homes. As you can imagine, you know, due to the scale of those properties, these were, you know, rather prosperous people that were living there. Spanish colonial, Dutch colonial, Tudor revival styles are also present within the district. After World War II, you did get a little more mix of housing with minimal traditional and ranch style houses. So that's one thing you'll see as you travel through there, that there are a variety of housing styles. Okay, local historic landmarks. The city has to date designated 4 local landmarks. Landmark designation applies to individual buildings, structures, sites, areas, or objects which are studied by the Preservation Commission and judged to have historical, architectural, archaeological, or cultural value. The designation is, you know, an honor, meaning the community believes the property deserves recognition and protection. The local landmark is designated by the city council. Well, that's the last step. The property owner, in most cases, has come to the city seeking landmark status. From there, staff will initiate contact with the North Carolina State Historic Preservation Office. We call them SHPO for short, S-H-P-O. They will write us back, say, hey, yeah, you know, we think that property is worthy of designation. From there, it goes to our Preservation Commission for their okay, and then they forward their recommendation to the City Council. One of the beneficial things about local landmark designation is that owners are eligible to apply for a 50% property tax deferral, so long as the important features of that landmark are maintained. Again, Rocky Mountain Mills, the mills itself, Imperial Tobacco Company building, which has been adaptively reused as Imperial Center for the Arts and Sciences. The former Thomas Hackney Braswell Memorial Library, and the power plant. Local landmark designation is really similar to designation as a local historic district in the fact that the property owner has to maintain the appearance of the building, exterior of the building. And if they want to change anything on the exterior of the building, they're required to also file for certificates, a certificate of appropriateness from our HPC. The Preservation Commission uses design guidelines to determine whether a particular change is deemed appropriate or not. I'll go ahead and plug the city's website, rockymountnc.gov/HPC. It's listed on the back of your booklet. Everything I've shared with you tonight and will share can be found on that website. The design guidelines are guidelines and not standards. That's an important thing to mention. The guidelines are developed soon after the establishment of the Preservation Commission in the late 90s. The guidelines are based off the Secretary of the Interior's standards for rehabilitation and preservation. The guidelines are posted online, and we have a booklet for property owners, and they're there to help the property owner understand how they may be able to successfully ask to change something on their property. Again, that applies within local districts and landmarks. Not only for alterations, but also exterior additions or demolition. The Preservation Commission cannot deny a property owner the right to demolish the property, but the general state statutes do allow the Preservation Commission to impose a delay of up to 365 days. We haven't had many properties demolished within our historic districts in the recent past. There have been some. Unfortunately, most of those have been initiated by the city council, the city's housing code division, due to absentee owners and no response from those owners. So I'll just say I think groups like Preservation Rocky Mount, there's opportunity for you all and others that are interested in preserving these districts to maybe not step up yourselves, but help lead an effort to find people that would be interested in help save those homes. So a COA. Review to make sure that what you want to do is consistent with the guidelines, and that's specific to the context of the district you're in. Obviously, the guidelines for the downtown are going to be a little different for what's expected in the residential historic districts. Those applications are processed through the Development Services Department, and again, they forward it to the Preservation Commission, who meets on a monthly basis. Does anybody own a property in a local historic district that you know of? Yeah,
I do.
Yeah, Jean does. She's been through the process a few times, but that's been one of the more successful cases that we can point to, where the owner wanted to keep things for the most part as they were, and she's done a great job to preserve the house that she has there in Edgemont. So that's the red tape. On the other hand, there are incentives for owners of properties within historic districts, or if you own a historic landmark. And those are tax credits, rehab tax credits available through both the federal government and the state. They're claimable on your income tax. I think the federal credit is about 10% of the investment that you make into the property. The state credit here in Edgecombe and Nash County is about 20% back. So if you were to do $10,000 worth of work, I think is the minimum threshold, you could get $2,000 back as a credit, on your income taxes, and that's a credit is a dollar for dollar match. So that's a big deal. A few years ago, those credits were threatened to be pulled back, but there was a push from preservationists all across the state to save them, and legislature recognized the people and reestablished those credits. The tax credits are processed through SHPO, the State Historic Preservation Office. If you are claiming a tax credit, then even if you're only in a national district and not a local district, you are expected to do the work to the standards of the Secretary of Interior. Also, one thing that I'll mention here that we offer locally through the city are matching grants. This was a new program that the city put in place last fiscal year for properties within the city that are 50 years or older. To be designated as a historic property, that's the first box you have to check. So while we couldn't target them specifically to historic districts, it was put in place with the mind that they would help property owners within historic districts because, these are important areas of our city. I do anticipate that those programs will be funded again this coming year, starting in July. There are 3 different programs. Two of them are income-based, but the third is not. And we will match you up to $12,500 of the investment you make. So if you spend $25,000, you can claim the whole $12,500. Anything above $25,000, obviously you'll stop at $12,500. Anything below, if you do $20,000, we'll match you $10,000. If you have a home that's older than 50 years and you need work done, I advise you to seek out our Community Development Division at the city sooner than later and get your application in early. We exhausted the funds early in the game this past year. I think we were allocated around $250,000, so the money went pretty quick. On our website, we have a few links that are a great resource. There is an interactive map that the SHPO maintains, where you can go and find information on any of the historic districts here in Rocky Mount, but also information on properties that have not yet been designated. There are many properties in the city that are only on what they call the study list. They've been recognized as important, but there's not anyone who has done that research project that I mentioned to prepare a nomination to moving forward to be officially recognized. So that interactive website will give you information on those properties, and there are more that have been recognized than you may realize. If you get any free time, click around that. It's very interesting. Also, there's links to the SHPO's information for property owners on technical guidance Also links to historic preservation's tradespeople. If you have work that needs to be done. Again, the whole gamut of information is available via the website. One of the neat things that I know that Preservation Rocky Mount does is operate the salvage store there on Falls Road. I'd like to initiate with the group more dialogue on how we, the city, can be supportive of that and how you can help support the city. There are a number of homes that are slated to be demolished once the funding comes available for those homes. And from time to time, a few of them have architectural features that are worth saving and not ending up in the landfill. So I'll say it now, we need to figure out how we can work together to try to save many of those, if not the entire home, at least some of the cool features of the homes. That's pretty much the gist of what I am able to speak with you all about this evening. Hope you found it somewhat entertaining. I'm glad to answer any questions you all may have or engage in discussion. Yes, ma'am.
I was wondering, hey, I'm AJ. I was wondering if you could just sort of run through the steps. If someone is in one of these local districts and they want to do something to their house and they need a certificate of appropriateness, sort of what are the steps they should follow? Like, I want to paint my house, I paint it and then come to you and say, this is what I did? Or, so what's the timeline? That happens, so maybe some of us want to know, well, hey, how many days out do I need to start this process?
Yeah, great question. The process is pretty streamlined, I'd say. I mentioned that our Preservation Commission meets on the fourth Tuesday of each month, so generally our cutoff to accept applications is the first Tuesday of the month, 3 weeks. Being that we have to follow the certificate of appropriateness requires a public hearing. The Preservation Commission is recognized as a quasi-judicial board. That means that they essentially operate as a lower level of the court system. If you happen to apply for a COA and not get the judgment that you wanted, you could appeal all the way to the state Supreme Court if they were willing to entertain it. I find that interesting. So you file your application. How do you do that? The application is available online, as well as the guidelines that the Preservation Commission would use to judge your project. There are guidelines for each element of a building: roof, windows, painting, doors, siding, brick, again, all elements. File the application. Staff, for the present time, that's still me, will work with the property owner, hand in hand to figure out the best proposal to put forth. There are some owners who have no clue, so there's at times a lot of education involved, but in other instances there are people who come forth and know more about what they're doing than I can even offer assistance. Unfortunately, you mentioned painting and the incoming. We call that an after-the-fact request. We see that more often than we'd like, not always, but one of our challenges has been people who acquire a property and aren't necessarily informed that this property is located in a local historic district. So that's been a struggle, and that's been one of our main initiatives is to work with the real estate community and periodically do mailings to owners of historic property to better inform people about where those districts are and what exactly being in a district means for a property owner. Where are we? Once the application is filed, are we good on up to that point?
Sure, yeah.
Okay, once the application is filed, staff will develop a report, look at it against the guidelines and, give an overview of what is proposed. The property owner or applicant needs to provide documentation of, what the building looks like presently. And in the ideal world, they can provide elevations or drawings of what the building will look like after the work is done. Unfortunately, not everybody has the resources to provide that, but if they don't, staff will help work with them to produce something as best we can. So we take all that information from the application, compile a staff report for presentation to the commission. No less than 10 days prior to the meeting, we mail notices and more recently have started to post signs on the property to make the neighbors and community aware that, hey, someone is seeking to make changes to this property. So right there, I should note that not everything you want to do requires review from the Preservation Commission. Some things that are reversible or just minor in nature, changing a doorknob, can be reviewed by staff. Some things are considered routine maintenance, painting surfaces that have already been painted. We don't particularly regulate color. There are recommendations in the guidelines on colors that should be used, but we really don't have any legal grounds to be that specific. It's my understanding of things anyway. Go ahead.
So if you want to, if your house is already painted and you want to repaint it about the same color as what it already is,
Yeah.
would you need to file, or is that just?
No. It's
touch-up?
it'd be a courtesy on your part to make staff aware. So in case you did paint it a white house now neon orange,
Right,
I know I'd have knowledge when the people started calling in
right.
to say, yeah, we talked and she did, but we couldn't do much about it.
But if you're going to paint a white house white, then,
Yeah, no worries.
okay.
The thing when painting is of concern is when you're painting surfaces that were not previously painted. And that comes into play like here downtown where you have exposed brick. In some cases, the brick, that could be damaging to the brick. So we do require review of that. So thanks, you helped me point out the different levels. So compile the report. Here we are, fourth Tuesday of the month, 7 o'clock at the Preservation Commission meeting. We present that report to the commission, and they hold their hearing, weigh the evidence, and decide whether what you proposed meets the guidelines or does not meet the guidelines.
That's subjective, right?
I'm sorry?
That's subjective, right?
Yes, sir. Again, guidelines and not standards. So, it's 9 humans at the table and not 9 robots. So they're able, well, I guess robots are probably pretty smart nowadays if you're keeping up with technology. But yeah, so they have that, they're able to have empathy with the owner and come to reasonable judgments on whether the project is fitting or not. So once they determine whether it lines up with the guidelines or does not, they'll then render a decision as to whether they're going to issue that certificate or not. If they do issue it, the certificate is mailed to the applicant, and they're free to move forward with the work. If it requires a permit, if you're doing some building or construction, some alterations, then you still have to get your permit as you normally would, but you're free to move forward. If you do not get a successful decision, again, you can appeal to the city's Zoning Board of Adjustment. If they don't go side with you, then you can appeal to the local court system. So that's pretty much how that process flows.
What happens if people do not go through the process, the alterations to the process?
Okay. If they do not go through the process and staff becomes aware that, changes have been made, it is considered a zoning violation. So we issue a citation and fine, and that fine accrues daily if we're that mean, until, the property is brought into compliance, until you come pursue your certificate of appropriateness. We have had instances where people did work and came to us after the fact, and their certificate was denied. Again, they're humans, so in most cases, they give them a little bit of time, a cushion, if you will, to rectify the issue before staff starts levying that financial penalty against the property. Yes?
So if you live in a national district but not a local district, do you still have to apply for the COA?
You do not.
Okay.
You do not. The only time that you'd be required to meet any guidelines or standards is if you are pursuing a tax credit.
So if you are pursuing a tax credit, then would you need to do the COA?
You wouldn't do the COA. You would work with the State Historic Preservation Office. Again, you want to do this, reach out to them before you start, because there are certain steps that they expect you to follow along the way. Documenting the existing conditions with photos, providing them information on what exactly you plan to do, and then they'll make the determination of whether the way you plan to go about your work qualifies as an eligible project. Yes, sir.
Does HBC use sensibility, meaning that you buy a house for $40,000 and needs a new slate roof that might cost $25,000, $30,000?
Yeah,
But yet there's materials out there that look like slate,
yeah.
that fraction of the cost. How does your HBC look at that?
On a case-by-case basis. Yeah, so there have been some properties where, with slate roofs, where the owner was required to keep the slate. Generally, the guidelines encourage repair of what you have. You can't repair it, they want you to replace it in kind. If you can't do that, then it's going to be a long meeting.
Well, is there any thought of a moratorium, such as areas that are, I would say, less developed, where, houses are, as we're talking about, the city will possibly demolition?
Yeah.
Somebody can come in and restore it, but let's maybe in that neighborhood do something where you don't require the slate roof until more build-up in that particular neighborhood.
Yeah, so again, case-by-case basis, while we've required owners to repair what they have, we have in other cases allowed a substitute material to be applied to the roof.
But then you have a precedent set, so how do you sometimes deal with it? Once you get case by case, or?
Yeah,
Subjective?
it's subjective.
Okay.
Yes, sir. So in that case where a house is falling in on itself
Yeah.
and you're, coming in ready to make an investment to save the house. If the only issue is you want to change the roof, we'll probably forego making you do an in-kind repair of the roof in order to save the structure itself.
Makes sense.
Yes, sir.
So why is it not standard? So
Why?
I go up and I go and say, I'm going in the falls, right?
Uh-huh,
And here's my standard.
yeah.
Why is there not a standard? So before I even purchase a property, I know here's a standard.
Yeah,
Why did you guys not develop a standard?
yeah. It's just not the practice across the state. I think you'd find that most preservation commissions across the country operate off of guidelines and not standards in order to allow that flexibility.
I can understand you have a standard and then you have to file a change request or something like that. Here's a non-standard request. I filed it, but here's my standard. I know you can go in and do this before I even buy the property. But if I come to you, I buy a property and it's subjective like that, then I struggle with, like the gentleman said, we struggle with what's going to get passed and what's not going to get passed, and things are tied up, right? If you have a standard versus here's a standard, but I file a non-conforming request, a change request, and say, hey, here's what I want to do.
That ones are pretty intricate though, if you look at them. If you kind of look at those as a standard, they're very detailed, the IHS. I mean, there's like 12 different things or like areas or something, isn't there something like that? And
Yes.
I mean, it's very specific,
Yeah.
so.
I would just say the standard is what's there to start with. That's the standard. And if you want to change from what the standard is, then you have to make a request to change it. But the standard is, if it's a slate roof, the standard is a slate roof. If you've got these columns, certain types of columns, the standard is the same type of columns need to go back. And if you don't want to do that, then you have to make that. That's the way I look at it.
That's
Basically, just accept the risk. And realize that it is a risk and accept it.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
So, all over Rocky Mount, but also in the historic districts, there's boarded up houses everywhere. We send letters, we try to contact the owners, and almost never do we get a response. And these houses just get worse and worse until they fall in on themselves and then are destroyed, right?
Yeah.
So what can we do as investors to purchase these properties? Is there help for us to contact these owners? And the weeds are high. I know there's probably weed violations. We just ran across the house the other day, had $4,000 weed violation on it. So I'm assuming if it gets to that point, right now it's doing something and trying to communicate with these folks.
Yeah, yeah, we do reach out to the property owners in those situations. Our community code division of the Public Works Department is tasked with documenting issues with residential buildings and nuisance issues like tall grass. My suggestion would be to establish a rapport with our community code staff. Kelly, she's in community development. Kelly Cook is the supervisor in community code. And he has a staff that, they go out and, inspect the residential properties and, like I said, again, document nuisance issues. But before a house is torn down, there's a process, there's steps. Property owner is contacted, there's a hearing, give that property owner some odd amount of time to.
We don't want to let the house get to that point.
Yeah.
I mean, you go in Edgemont area, there's beautiful houses where
Absolutely.
the front of them are falling off of it. It's like,
Right,
So many of the property owners are not you can't contact many of them.
Yeah.
So do we just let them fall to the
No,
ground,
you
or do
don't.
we take steps to get them into
Yeah,
investors'
the
hands?
steps to get them into investors' hands, again, is to dialogue with our community code division. You see a property, contact them, say, hey, this place looks like it's in bad shape. Do you have a file on it? Yes, we do. This is the owner. They're responsive or they're not responsive.
And if they're not,
If
what's,
they're not responsive, you say, hey, well, before you tear this place down, I'm interested. I've got the resources to save it. We don't want all our houses torn down. That's gonna leave a gap tooth effect and,
saw one on Sunset?
Yeah.
It's like, you know, why are we letting,
right.
as a community, letting these houses get to that point?
There's an appetite on our council to move more toward these dwellings, getting them in the hands of people who can do something with them rather than tearing them down, incurring a bill, and then passing that on to the next person who is not going to want to invest in that property because it has a bill. So it's establishing that communication and figuring out the mechanism to have those properties.
Follow up on that question.
transferred. Yes.
Whatever house, I mean, reality, there are some houses that just have to be torn down. They're to that point. Do you in the city have any right to come in and salvage things at this point? Or it has to be bulldozed, taken away, no matter if they're beautiful mantles, architectural features?
I can address that.
Yeah.
I'm the salvage store chair, and what
Yes.
I've negotiated is with Kelly Cook, who is the community supervisor. I've negotiated a deal with him that if there's going to be any house that will be demolished, we are contacted first, and we are allowed to come in and salvage them. Now, some of them, if they're a tremendous safety hazard, it's
Yeah.
full of mold, you're going to fall through the floor and die. You know, we can't go in there. But
Details.
you know, hey, we ain't scared. 4 of us almost fell through the carpet that time, remember? You know, but we do go in there. If you are interested, you can sign up to be on our salvage team. And he contacts me, we come in, it's usually very last minute, but we have started that up. And all of that stuff goes to our salvage store. So we save the stuff in Rocky Mountain to be saved.
But there was a house we went into that we salvaged that we believed could have been saved.
It could have been saved, and it was at the request of the property owner. It was right there on Grace Street. It was 421 Great South Grace Street. And what can we do? Because the owner was just tired of dealing with it. You know, and there was nothing wrong with this house. There was nothing wrong. It was the saddest
Great
thing.
floors.
So I guess my question is, owners have these properties, right? Is there a list of, I mean, I'm new to the area, so I'm trying to understand. Is there a list or something?
Yes.
Are they contacted, here's the third notice?
Yes,
Then it goes to this?
yes.
Now it goes into this
Yes, it
state.
really is, and it's all based on, the way the city does it is that it's based on the cost of repairs versus the cost of the actual property itself, and not the land value, the structure value. And when it reaches a certain threshold, that's when it's deemed to be eligible for demolition. It's just eligible, and he's got, I mean, just filing cabinets full of properties that are eligible, and now it's a little bit more of a runaround if it's something in a local historic district, so those don't get torn down as quickly. So that's what happens, and they only have it so much of a budget to get them done. So it's another thing is that when we come in and salvage, that's less money that the city has to pay for the landfill. So we're saving taxpayer dollars by doing that as well. But that's what it is. And so if the city gets a bigger budget for demolition, more of them are going to come down. But that it's like a 40%, when it reaches a 40% cost of repairing the house, getting up to livable standards, a certificate of occupancy, versus the value of the structure itself, that's the threshold when it's on that dilapidated list, eligible. And with these lower, I mean, with these houses that are in lower income areas, it's very, very little work that you would need to do to reach that threshold.
So is that Kelly Cook that
Yes,
has that?
this is Kelly Cook.
Yeah.
He's very, very responsive. He's willing to work with you and.
Do you have his number on that?
I do, I can give it to you,
Okay.
yeah.
So one more quick question. So this list that you have, is it online or is it?
No, it's not.
Yeah, it's going to require some initiative on you, the investor, to reach out to Mr. Cook and his division.
He's
It's-
no responsible.
It's interesting because I know where I came from in Columbus, they had a list online, so,
Yeah.
so it's not, it's different.
I will say this, the city, we are currently in the process of revamping our geographic information system, our GIS. That's mapping. My department, the information we maintain, in the coming months, we're gonna really ramp up what we post online, open government. So you know exactly where development is happening in Rocky Mount. That same ability will be there for the Community Code Division, where they can document, hey, these are the properties that are slated for demolition, these are the ones that are, approaching that threshold. There's different levels.
So I guess my next question is, are the properties on these lists deemed, have a designation? So this is a tax property, this is a foreclosure, this is, what is it? Does it spell it out?
So what you would get from the city are gonna be houses that have documented less than standard conditions.
And will it have a cost associated with it, how much it will be to buy the property?
So the repairs itself have an estimate,
Based on, you said
based on
appraisal
the
now?
inspection done by the staff.
The city has no authority over the sale of the
Yeah,
property.
we don't,
No, I understand they don't have authority over the sale, no different than they have authority on, anything else. But what I'm asking is, I want to understand what triggers that property to be up for sale?
They don't do sales.
Yeah, no,
City of
so-
Rocky Mount does not do any
Right.
tax foreclosures or sales.
yeah, that's a costly endeavor to foreclose on a property through, tax sale.
So you guys just let it kind of, just
Let
let it happen?
Yeah, unfortunately, and that's an economical decision.
But they're happy to get somebody to buy it that will pay taxes, so.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly. That's the sunshine that you
yeah,
gotta take away from this part of the discussion that we're having.
yeah.
Are there lenders in Rocky Mount that will work with people to do the rehabs? I know sometimes local banks and things take a real interest. I know, some of the national ones do not because their
Yeah,
lending is actually out of a different area.
yes, sir. I would say yes to that. In addition to the railroad and tobacco, the other industry Rocky Mountain is popular for is banking, finance. We got a number of local banks here. I believe that, yes, you make your case to them, they'll support you.
Because as an example, I'll say BB&T is not one of them that is a typical partner, even though they're large in this area.
Well, even the state of
I would
Louisiana.
encourage you to come to this room next Wednesday night when
Oh,
the
yes.
Triangle Real Estate Investors Association meets. Mindy and David are members of it. I work for Ben Braddock, the man who owns Station Square here. He started it. So there are lenders, investors, property managers, a really interesting, highly motivated group of people from Chapel Hill, Cary, Apex, Wilson, all over. So if you're a member of TRIA, it's $5. If you're not, it's $20 with their refreshments and everything. And it's always a really great program. And actually, David and Mindy will be the presenters
Yeah,
this
so-
time. So it's same Batcave.
It's not an endorsement, but just knowledge of those local banks that have made investments. The credit union has a real estate branch. We work with them to obtain certificates of appropriateness. And self-help credit union has properties that they've rehabbed within our historic districts.
Just how long has it been since these guidelines and things have been revisited? In terms of what now is going on in the community with the revitalization, and all of this investment and energy interested in the community. Some of this is working and some of it obviously isn't. And when we all know that the object is to encourage this saving of these places, some of this stuff is what I would call an obstacle to grace. And I want to know how long it's been since maybe some people who are involved in this, plus those that have been in the trenches a long time, have come let us reason together and re-look at these guidelines.
Yes, ma'am. Great question. There has not been a wholesale review of the guidelines since they were established.
It's time.
Yeah, I mentioned that the guidelines are based off of the Secretary of the Interior's
Yep.
standards.
Yep.
And when you think about it, you know, you're talking about a historic property and these specific style of house. So it's hard to, you know, take that comprehensive look at, well, this doesn't apply anymore when it's the same style house that it's been. But to that point, in the 8 years I've worked with our commission, I have noticed them relax on certain things. When I started, they were really, you know, steadfast that rigid. If you had a wood window, you got to go back with the wood window.
Yep.
Now, they're apt to allow you to use some substitute material, composite or aluminum. However,
Well, mid-century modern.
wait.
That's in like kind.
Wait. However, this is the important piece. The grids, like these windows, for example, have, you know, a grid with a profile. You're required to at least have that. You know, if it's a 3/3, 6/6 window, you can use an aluminum window, but it has to have external muntins or grills in that same orientation. So that's where they've relaxed to a degree in instances like that. If you're doing, you know, there's been slate roofs where they've allowed architectural shingles to go in place, that type of thing. If you had I believe, they haven't done it yet, but I believe if you had a wood siding, they may let you go with a hardy, you know, composite type siding material. You're never going to get vinyl.
I think that's why this gentleman right here, if my intuition tells me, is why he brought up and used the word standard.
Yeah.
Because it's certainly all of us understand that if you're going to let Stephanie do this, then that means, well, now she would like to do X, Y, and Z. So now you let Stephanie do it, but you didn't let her do it. And with all of the investment and the amount of people that are now involved in this, it seems to me it becomes more important than ever so that people going into this, I love what Jean said, okay, the standard is what the house was. But you're already saying, yes, but we'll fudge just a little if you can make a good enough case.
Right.
So it seems to me that the more we've got coming, to get ahead of this by saying, then we don't have to, if you'll pardon the expression, screw around with it, but the standard becomes more, what is the word I want? Accessible. That isn't the word I want, but you get what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
And I would encourage us to think about how we can have our cake and eat it too here, that, you know, certainly we welcome all of the investment. And we, as preservationists, we certainly, you know, have a stand to make in that. And yet somehow or other, the cake and eating it too. And it seems to me if it was revisited, everybody might feel a little happier. They might not like every decision, but at least we would all feel like we're on level playing field?
Yeah. I would say in my experience, they have been a pretty reasonable and
I'm sure.
reasonable board. They're very cognizant of setting a precedent.
It puts them in a terrible place, you know, they're
Yeah.
there to keep watch over things, and that's why we want them there.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, as you said, they're people, so they try to have a heart for some of this.
Yeah.
But the more we wait on solving some of this, the worse it's gonna get.
Okay, can you elaborate on what exactly, like, what's an example, I guess, of an issue that,
I'll give you an example.
okay,
One of my employees bought a house in one of the historical districts. The house up the street had a concrete curb. One of them didn't have a concrete curb. They had gravel. So he goes and files and says, I want to just put gravel down because my other historical house has gravel. Goes and files the paperwork, they deny him. But the house right down the street has the same gravel curb
in Rocky Mount?
in Rocky Mount. I'm not gonna say any names,
So I
but
don't
that's the
know
way
that was
it needs a standard.
Yeah, and I'm not sure that was that a property in a historic
It was
district?
in the historical district, yes, sir.
Well, I don't recall that coming before us. It may have been a
I
driveway
can address
permit.
that, just from a historic preservation minded kind of thing. So
Yeah.
the driveway is as much a part of the historic landscape and integrity and setting of a property as the siding, as the windows, as the landscaping would be. So if a house could be in a historic district, you could have a house that was built in 1872 in a district and another one that's built in 1920, where it might be very significant differences in the type of driveway materials that were used. An example would be a 4-square house. It would be very traditional to have 2 skinny rows of gravel going up to the house instead of one very wide driveway. And so I can see how, you know, an HBC might say, well, this house is a 4-square, and traditionally it would have had the 2 little road lanes going up, and it would not be one giant paved thing. So no, we want you to keep it the gravel. Whereas in the original, and in some other house that was built in the 30s or turn of the century, where there was just one wide swath of pavement or something, you go, okay, well, that's what we want you to keep. So I can see how one house right next door to another, they might not have the exact same rules apply, because they're 2 different historic settings.
So is there a standard?
The standard is what it
The
was.
standard is, well, and that's the thing, the standard
Was
is.
there no footprint there, right?
Well, he didn't have any kind of.
There's no footprint there.
He had no
There's
driveway.
no footprint.
So Seth, question.
I'm not gonna argue with it, but all I wanna say is
Yes.
just understand what the standard is.
I'll just say to that, I don't recall that coming before us. That may have been an application for a driveway permit, and they
Maybe it
required that they have a paved as opposed to gravel. But if it were to have come to the HPC and as what's your name? Adrian alluded to, you know, the preponderance of the driveways in that neighborhood were gravel, HPC is certainly going to recognize that and allow that individual to go with the gravel. So I don't know that was one that came to.
I do want to just mention that we're right up at 7:30, so we can take a final question, but then maybe we can move
Quick
to email and
clarification.
phone calls.
Yes.
Your HPC,
Yes.
do they get the cases before the actual meeting? Do they have a chance to actually go out and see the particular things they're talking about?
Yeah.
Because that's important to see the neighborhood, because small little pictures can be very deceiving.
Yep.
So I want to make sure that they do go out and see.
Yes. They are made aware of the agenda beforehand. They know, you know, which properties have a case coming up. And many of them will go out in advance and survey the area so they can make an educated decision.
Do they have a copy of the case?
They receive via mail a copy of the staff report in advance.
Okay.
Because they're a quasi-judicial board, they cannot have discussion amongst each other about the particulars of the case, but they are allowed as individuals to marinate on things in advance of the meeting.
So they would be able to go out and see if one was like a gravel curb, or was a concrete curb.
Yes, sir, yes, sir. Good question.
Thank you all so much for coming.
Is there anybody that doesn't know where our Preservation Rocky Mountain salvage store is? Have you not been there?
Yeah. Who amongst you have been to the salvage store? Who amongst you has been to the Rocky Mount Mills? Okay, it's right down the street from the mill.
We're right across from the National Historical Hot Dogs.
Yeah.
But if you're looking for wood windows, we got them.
Thank you all so much for coming. I'm very encouraged by all the conversation, and I think JoSeth would agree that we'll have to do this again. And there are membership forms if you want to get involved.